Coming up on the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break, we'll bring you the latest news and information from the state capitol and CDE as we approach the budget deadline. Plus, we're talking about proposed federal gun legislation. We'll take you to Washington, D.C. to talk with one of our insiders about how it could impact gun safety here in California. The ACSA Legislative Lunch Break starts now. And it's just after 1 o'clock. We welcome you on a Wednesday to the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break. I'm Naj Alikhan, ACSA Senior Director of Marketing Communications. Welcome. Go ahead and jump onto our chat today. Say hello and let us know where you're watching from. Again, so honored to have you. Edgar is normally here with me today, but Edgar literally in the last 25 minutes received a call from his son's school about a possible COVID exposure. As all of you know, we have to be very fluid during these COVID times. So he had to step away from the show today. He was very disappointed because this is always the highlight of his week. So a big apology from Edgar to all of you for missing out on today's show. But we will cover the budget. Today is budget deadline day. We'll also take you to Washington, D.C. to talk about proposed federal gun legislation. Also want to just update you on some breaking news that happened just a little bit ago. This involving the COVID-19 vaccine for infants through preschoolers. Moderna and Pfizer's COVID-19 vaccines for infants through preschoolers has moved a step closer to FDA authorization. An FDA committee of independent vaccine experts voted to recommend the shots. Now, the FDA is likely to accept the committee's guidance, and then it's up to the Centers for Disease Control to approve it from that point on. So breaking news for you. Just wanted to give you that information. The COVID-19 vaccine for Moderna and Pfizer moving a step closer to availability for preschoolers through infants. Want to say hello, Grant Bennett, Gary Reller's on with us, Ellen Wheeler and Laura Dutch. I see Barbara Martinez is on there as well. Who is our first on? There's Mark Campbell from Calaveras. Our first one on the chat today. Again, so lucky to have all of you with us. It is budget deadline day here in the state of California. We know a budget was agreed upon earlier this week, but today is the deadline, and we know just because there's a deadline doesn't mean that the work is finished. So let's go ahead and bring on Megan Baer, ACSA's legislative advocate. She focuses on the budget. Megan, it's great to have you here with us on the show to give us a live update on what is happening on budget deadline day. I know that you and I talked previously. The budget was agreed upon on Monday ahead of today's deadline, but there's still work to be done. So what is still out there that our members need to know about that could impact our members moving forward?
Yeah, the legislature passed a budget early on Monday. However, it's a placeholder budget, and it allows them to meet the statutory deadline of June 15th to pass a budget. However, there is no deadline for the governor to sign a budget. And currently, negotiations are ongoing between the Senate, Assembly, and the governor's office. So we actually are still awaiting many big items that are going to impact schools this year. So that final deal, they're still negotiating when it comes to independent study, the rules that will govern that program next year, the expanded learning program, what level of funding districts will receive, whether there will be transportation funding or any mandate attached, as well as whether districts will get relief for COVID attendance related disruptions and what level of base increase. So many things are still being worked on, and we hope that we're going to see a final deal by July 1st, but no guarantees.
Well, actually, that was my question. We hope to see something by July 1st. Because we've got kind of this gray area where a budget has been agreed upon, but then there's still negotiations. Do we end up finding out about the budget, what it actually looks like before July 1, or should we just have that expectation we're not going to see it until it's signed?
We will see it. We'll still see it prior to that time. July 1st, the legislature recesses for about 4 weeks. So the hope is that they will get something done before that time. Otherwise, we're going to be looking at a budget that wouldn't be passed until late August, which has a series of negative impacts for all kinds of things.
Yeah, talk about unintended consequences with that. Let me ask you, because you've been in the state capitol during these budget days, during these final hours before a deadline, during these couple of weeks in between the deadline and when the budget needs to be signed. Take us into that room where these negotiations are happening. What is the experience like? What is the interaction like between lawmakers and advocates? Give us an insider's look.
Sure. So right now, the Senate, Assembly, and Governor's Office leadership are meeting and hashing out items, figuring out what they can agree upon, and what items they still have large areas of disagreement. And then there's horse trading. The different parties are going to have different priorities, and so on those items of disagreement, that's where kind of the real horse trading, and that's, where we get a little nervous as advocates too, because we hope that they're going to adopt our priorities. So
makes sense to me. Still an opportunity to stay tuned. Megan Baer, ACSA legislative advocate. Megan, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Folks, we're going to switch topics here. And this caught my attention, and then we'll go ahead and move to our guest who's coming in from Washington, D.C. This news story came in from Ohio earlier this week, that the Ohio governor signed a bill into law that makes it easier for teachers to legally carry guns in schools. The measure drastically reduces the amount of training teachers and other staff are required to undergo before they can possess a firearm on school grounds. Instead of 700 hours of training, teachers will be able to finish in less than 24 hours. Certainly a startling news story coming out of Ohio about making it easier to arm teachers. I'm interested to have any of you jump into our chat today. Give us some of your feedback on that. I know that I've spoken with a number of educators over the last few weeks, and especially after this news story came out, and they said, if that kind of thing was to happen here in California, if that was to move forward in California, they would get out of the education business. So I'm interested to hear what your feedback is. Go ahead and jump into our chat, say hello, and let us know what you're thinking on that. Let's go ahead and talk about this proposed gun legislation. It made news earlier this week that there is some type of proposed legislation moving through the Capitol, moving through Congress. And we wanted to bring in one of our insiders. Steve Voytek is a policy advisor from Foresight Law and Policy, ACSA's federal legislative body. Steve, great to have you here on the show. Can you give us some early details about what we know about this proposed bill, the high points of it, and what it really means?
Sure thing. Appreciate you having us on the show today. So as you've likely seen in the news and elsewhere, a bipartisan group of senators, mostly led by Chris Murphy of Connecticut, John Cornyn of Texas, announced a high-level framework agreement broadly aimed at enhancing school security, public mental health, while making some modest changes to gun safety measures. The exact details of this agreement are still being worked out. As we speak, this group is working to quickly translate the areas of consensus that we've seen in the headlines so far this week into concrete legislative text. This text is what will provide us greater clarity and insight into how a final bill would or wouldn't reduce mass shootings, the tragedies that we've seen elsewhere in the nation, in our nation's schools, and how it may impact school districts. Based on what we know so far, the core tenets of the agreement largely fit into one of these three categories. So the aspects related to guns broadly include funding incentives for states to adopt and implement so-called red flag laws. Right now, 19 states have those on the books, and they're broadly intended to allow courts and law enforcement officers to preemptively stop individuals from obtaining weapons if they're deemed a threat to themselves or other people. In a similar vein, they're also attempting to close the so-called boyfriend loophole, which is also intended to flag individuals who have been convicted of domestic violence or have a restraining order placed against them from obtaining weapons. Again, some of these are all kind of predicated on background checks. So that is also another aspect of this legislation, or at least emerging legislation, that seeks to clarify who is counted as a dealer of firearms. as well as to increase penalties around straw purchases. So these are like attempts to circumvent the kind of more regulated gun purchases that take place in this country. And then finally, there would be an enhanced review process for those under the age of 21, which would include a review of juvenile justice records and mental health records. Again, predicated on those transactions that are covered by background checks. Related to school security, the agreement will include funding for what the lawmakers are calling school safety resources right now. These are largely aimed at reducing school violence, providing training to school personnel and students. It remains unclear what these are likely to specifically entail, but it's a big priority for Republican lawmakers involved in these negotiations. I'd anticipate seeing some additional funding for school resource officers as part of that package as well. But again, it's really going to be dependent on that final legislative text that we're all kind of waiting for right now. And then finally, on the mental health front, the agreement would increase access to telehealth and mental health services, expand community behavioral center models, and it would also provide additional funding for school-based mental health and supportive wraparound services. So on this last point, senators have really indicated that a lot of those efforts would be focused on early identification and intervention programs. And that's really where that last point would focus on. So that's the broad strokes of the agreement that's emerging. But again, we're very much waiting on the legislative text sometime this week.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you mentioned the impact on schools. We had a couple of comments that came in. Maureen McClintock, sorry, Maureen, elementary K through 6th in San Jose, California. No guns for teachers. We will lose teachers and gain security guards who can't teach. Laura Dutch puts in here, no guns in classrooms. There are so many reasons why this is a bad idea, way too risky, unintended consequences, that's for sure. And folks, if you have questions for Steve, go ahead and put those into the chat. Steve, from what we read, there appears to be enough support right now to override the Senate filibuster. We heard from Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell yesterday saying that he supports the framework as it is structured right now. Can you walk us through the steps? Is this legislation, this proposed legislation, does it have enough support to get through that Senate filibuster? And what steps are ahead for it?
Yeah, I'm glad you flagged the McConnell comments last night. That is enormously significant for the prospects of this agreement getting across the proverbial finish line. Again, Mitch McConnell, Republican minority leader in the Senate, has indicated some support, at least at this framework agreement stage. So in terms of next steps, we're likely to see that legislative text soon, potentially as soon as today, but more likely later this week, which the Senate intends to quickly take up and pass prior to the congressional recess starting on July 4th. There are, of course, some more recent stumbling blocks right now. Right before I joined the call today, Republicans have reportedly taken issue with some of the aspects that we were just talking about earlier, particularly around those red flag laws and the closing of that boyfriend loophole and how that would be implemented in a final bill. I think these things will largely slow down the agreement, but not stop it entirely. So I do think that just given where things are right now, that there is a strong enough sort of will that this package, largely in its current form, will get across the finish line. What would happen next? This would really put the onus on the House to then take up and pass this legislation. So as you may have seen, the Democratic majority over in the House last week passed a much more expansive gun safety proposal. However, given the rules of the Senate, which require 60 votes to pass most anything, including this gun reform legislation, congressional leadership appear very likely to approve this much more modest Senate proposal. So I think that's really what we're seeing now is the House kind of coming out with a much bigger proposal, the Senate saying, hey, wait, this is never going to pass our chamber, but we think we could pass these areas of consensus. And that's what we're seeing emerge right now.
Let me ask you, because this is day 22 since the school shooting in Uvalde, Texas. Does this proposed bill even exist today, if not for that school shooting in Texas?
It's a good question. I don't think it would. I think the tragedy in Uvalde certainly was the initial catalyst for this agreement. I also think that there is another key motivating factor here for both Democrats and Republicans right now, which is the upcoming midterm elections. And so both sides strongly desire to be seen responding in some way to this latest mass shooting before voters head to the polls this fall. I think there's a lot of sort of energy in both bases right now to see some kind of action on this issue. So I think that's what ultimately got both sides to the table this time around. The political stars and related gravitational orbits aligning in just the right way at this specific moment to get to yes.
Now, here in California, we have some of the strictest gun laws in the country. You've given us kind of the high points of this proposed legislation. How could this bill impact what could happen or already is happening here in California?
So I think U.S. gun policy right now is really determined by the lowest common denominator. So that is to say that the effectiveness of stricter gun laws like those that we have in California will only work to the extent that other states are mirroring those efforts. And so this is why the current agreement that we're looking at now stops short of nationwide bans or other sorts of nationwide requirements. This is really a package of lots of different carrots, those that are really intended to incentivize and encourage various things that policymakers will hope that will reduce gun violence without any related sticks or types of punishments.
And folks, again, if you have any questions for Steve, go ahead and put those into the chat. We're also looking for your comments today on that bill that was signed in Ohio about reducing the amount of training that teachers would need before they can carry a firearm in a school. Steve, there are some that are applauding this first step. This bill, this proposed bill, is a first step in confronting a larger issue. Others are saying that this proposed legislation doesn't go far enough. I'm going to ask you to bring out your crystal ball. Do you get a sense that this is kind of a one-off right now because of the political environment in DC? Or do you think this is maybe a first step towards something larger over the next few years?
So predicting anything that Congress is likely to do or not to do is a very dangerous sort of endeavor. So
that's why I asked you to do it, not me.
I appreciate that. Yeah. So I do want to predicate my remarks with that important caveat. But I do get the sense that this is likely the furthest Congress is likely to go on the gun issue for some time. It's been widely reported that elements of this agreement were very closely vetted by participating Senate Republicans through extensive polling of gun owners. And so the elements that are in this framework agreement are all, at least according to the latest Republican polling on these issues, supported by the vast majority of current gun owners. And so some of the numbers that I've seen recently across the board, 80% in some cases for some of these elements for folks that already own guns in this country. Equally as significant, Senate Republicans have largely promoted this framework agreement to colleagues by highlighting what is not in the final package, right? So the absence of universal background checks, mandatory waiting periods for gun purchases, high capacity magazine bans, safe storage requirements, and restrictions on the possession or sort of attainment of assault weapons have all been used as sort of selling points within the Republican caucus to garner the needed support to pass this bill. So I think that's really a telling sign of A, the likelihood of this getting across the finish line, but also tells us something in terms of what we're likely to see or not see in the future. So because of this, I'm not confident that Congress is likely to go further in the near future, especially if one or both of the congressional chambers in the House and the Senate switches control following the midterm elections this fall. So I think that's also something that will have a really significant impact on gun legislation and reform in the future.
So let me see if I got this correct from what you just said. One party seems to be selling this legislation as what is in it, whereas another party is selling it as this is what's not in it. Am I correct with that?
That's largely how I think Republican politics right now are operating. I think there's just, within the party right now, there is not a lot of political will to significantly reduce access to weapons given the Second Amendment, right? And so I think that's largely what is kind of like pushing them back a little bit on this more modest proposal that we're seeing now. But it is, I think, an important first step in school safety and gun safety. And, it's in many ways better than nothing at this point, especially after many years of mass shootings and tragedies like we've seen in Uvalde.
We have a couple of questions in our chat here. Gary Reller, principal over at Matthew Gage Middle School in Riverside Unified, asked the question, are there discussions at the national level about providing funding so that all schools can have an on-campus resource officer? Are you hearing anything related to that funding piece?
Yeah, I think that is likely going to be a component piece of one of the aspects, I think, on the school safety resources bit of this agreement. Again, the frustrating part here is that this is a high level agreement, so it's in plain language, and I think the devil is in the details, right?
Yeah.
Translating this to legislative text, which I know I sound like a broken record about, but I think that would likely be where we would see additional funding or support for school resource officers. And there is precedent for that. We've seen that in past legislation in many Congresses ago, where, after Columbine, where there was more federal support for SROs. So that's likely to be included.
I want to ask one other Gary question. Gary asks, what are the discussions about mental health pertaining to gun violence? If I remember when you gave the high points, there is a piece about mental health in this proposed legislation. What are the discussions about mental health pertaining to gun violence that you're hearing?
It's mostly around increasing student access to mental health services, particularly in schools. And so what shape or form that takes, again, is going to be, I think, dependent on that final legislative text. But in principle, this framework agreement is intended to expand all student access to that. So providing resources to schools and districts to potentially hire more counselors, mental health professionals, to provide those services directly to students. I think there would also be likely a component in there where they're also the ones kind of keeping an eye out for potentially problematic behavior or early warning signs, parts of those things that we talked about earlier around early identification and prevention, and those interventions that are so important before tragedy happens.
Steve Voytek, policy advisor, Foresight Law and Policy, ACSA's federal advocacy arm. Steve, it's been great to have you here on the show. We'll have you again next time. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you. Appreciate being on. Take care.
Thank you. And thank you, folks, for those couple of questions. Gary Reller, thank you so much for that. Certainly carried on that conversation. Let me give you a little bit of information first about what you've been watching, the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break. If you like what you see here, go ahead and subscribe to us on Facebook and on YouTube. You can like us on Facebook and subscribe on YouTube. You'll get alerts when we're coming on the air. Also want to remind you, EdCal, there is an edition coming up, not this week, but the following week. We'll have some feature stories on our Every Student Succeeding winners and our Administrator of the Year award winners as well. And of course, if you have any news to share, anything happening in your school districts or your school specifically, go ahead and send photos and articles to our EdCal editor, Michelle Carr at mcarl@acsa.org. Folks, we are heading towards the bottom of the hour. Want to thank you so much for being with us today. Edgar will be on next time. Fingers crossed that his son and members of his family all feeling better the next time he comes on. Thank you so much again for being with us today. Have a great rest of the day and great rest of the week. We'll see you next time here on the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break.